Seoul's Underworld had a word for what Raven Monroe was supposed to be: temporary. A captive bride brought into Park Min-jun's empire under contract, present by arrangement, compliance by necessity, gone the moment the terms expired. The organization knew what she was. The organization had decided what she was worth. The organization was wrong on both counts and would spend 18 months discovering it without knowing that was what they were doing. Because while Park Min-jun's men were watching his rivals, his finances, his territory, while every dangerous variable in his world was being monitored and managed by the most feared syndicate in Seoul, nobody was watching Raven Monroe. Nobody thought to. She was the captive bride. She was decorative. She was temporary. She was, in the specific and patient way of a woman who understood that invisibility was the most powerful position available to her, building an empire inside the one they thought they were keeping her in. The contract had 18 months remaining. She used all of them. And on the day the contract ended, when every person in that room was waiting for her to leave, Raven Monroe sat down, looked at Park Min-jun across the table, and told him what came next. If you are here for a story about a woman who turned captivity into a throne, subscribe right now and drop a comment telling me, would you have had the patience? Because this is not a story about escape. Raven Monroe did not run. She did not fight the contract or the circumstances that created it. She sat inside the most dangerous organization in Seoul, and she watched and she learned and she built. Quietly, without credit, from a position that everyone had decided was powerless, until the day the contract expired and she was the most important person in the room. Park Min-jun thought he was keeping her. He was, without knowing it, giving her everything she needed. This is the story of what she did with 18 months and one very expensive miscalculation. Let's begin. The contract was 11 pages, and Raven had read all of them 3 times before she signed, because she was not the kind of person who entered arrangements without understanding their complete terms, even arrangements she had not chosen and could not refuse. The circumstances that produced the contract were not complicated in their mechanics, only in their consequences. Her father's debt to Park Min-jun's organization had reached a threshold that the organization's standard resolution process would have addressed in a way that was final and irreversible. Raven had presented an alternative: 18 months as Min-jun's contracted wife, present at the functions the role required, compliant with the organizational appearances it served, gone at the term's conclusion with the debt cleared and her family intact. Min-jun had assessed the alternative as acceptable. The contract was drawn. She signed it with the steady hand of someone who had already processed the grief of the situation privately and was now operating in the space beyond it. She arrived in Seoul on a Thursday. By Friday evening, she had a complete preliminary assessment of the organization she had entered. The assessment was not something she shared. She held it in the internal architecture she had always used for information that required keeping. Organized, accessible, building toward conclusions she would reach in her own time. What she had seen in the first 36 hours was sufficient to confirm what the organizational language had suggested. Min-jun's empire was formidable in its reach and inconsistent in its structure, which was the specific profile of an organization built around an exceptional individual rather than a durable system. It had significant strengths and specific vulnerabilities, and the vulnerabilities had been present long enough to have become invisible to everyone inside it. She was not inside it. Not yet. Not in the way that produced blindness. The organization's assessment of her was delivered without words across the first week, in the specific quality of attention she received, which was the attention given to furniture rather than to people. Functional, occasional, entirely without curiosity. She was the boss's contracted wife, present at meals, present at appearances, present in the peripheral vision of men who had decided she was decorative before she arrived and found nothing in her first week to revise the assessment. She dressed and behaved in ways that confirmed the assessment, because confirmation was what the first week required. She made 2 decisions by the end of it. The first, she would not waste the time she had been given. 18 months inside the most informationally rich environment she had ever occupied from a position that nobody was monitoring. This was not captivity, it was access. She would use every day of it. The second, she would reveal nothing of what she was building until what she had built was large enough to be undeniable. A capability revealed too early was a capability that could be managed. A capability revealed at the right moment, fully formed and comprehensively demonstrated, was something else entirely. She made both decisions quietly in the room they had given her on a Sunday evening while the organization moved around her like water around something it had not assessed as worth navigating. She opened the notebook she had brought from home. She began to write. The most useful thing about being underestimated, Raven had learned long before Soul, was that people did not manage their behavior around you. They managed their behavior around threats, around variables that required accounting for, around people whose observation of them carried consequence. A woman they had decided was decorative was none of those things, which meant she moved through the organization's daily life like a presence without weight, there but not registering, which was the most complete form of access available. She used it with the systematic thoroughness of someone who understood that this window would not remain open indefinitely, and that everything she gathered now was infrastructure for everything she would build later. The hierarchy was her first map. It was not the hierarchy on paper. Organizations of this kind rarely had accurate paper hierarchies because the formal structure documented what the organization wanted to present about itself rather than how it actually functioned. She mapped the real one, built from observation across 4 weeks of meals, functions, and the specific texture of how men deferred to each other in unguarded moments, who spoke first, who waited, who changed their posture when certain people entered rooms, who was consulted privately before decisions were announced publicly. The real hierarchy was legible once you knew how to read it, and it was considerably different from the formal one in 3 significant respects that she noted and held for later. The financial flows were harder to map without documentation, so she mapped them from behavior instead. The specific anxiety that accompanied certain monthly periods, the functions that were attended with different energy depending on variables she eventually identified as liquidity indicators, the way that 2 of the senior lieutenants discussed resource allocation in terms that revealed to someone listening with the right framework where the organization's money was moving and where it was constrained. She built the financial picture across 6 weeks from fragments, the way an archaeologist builds a complete vessel from shards, patiently, precisely, with constant revision as new pieces arrived. The loyalty lines were the most important map and the most nuanced to construct. Loyalty in an organization like this one was not binary, it was conditional, layered, and highly sensitive to perceived momentum. She identified 4 categories across the organization's senior membership, those whose loyalty was to Min Jun personally and would follow him through any outcome, those whose loyalty was to the organization's success and would align with whoever demonstrated the capacity to produce it, those whose loyalty was primarily self-interested and was currently directed at Min Jun because he represented the best available option, and those whose loyalty had fault lines, historical grievances, unaddressed ambitions, or relationships with external parties that created competing obligations. The 4th category was the most valuable intelligence she gathered in the first 2 months. Fault lines in a loyalty structure were both vulnerabilities and opportunities, depending entirely on what you did with the knowledge of their existence. She did nothing with it yet. She continued to map. The picture was not complete, and she had learned, in ways that had cost her before she internalized the lesson, that acting on an incomplete picture was the most expensive mistake a strategic mind could make. She kept building. The organization kept not watching her. The window stayed open. She used every hour of it. His name was Shin Tae-young, and he drove the 3rd car in the convoy, which meant he was neither senior enough to drive Min Jun nor junior enough to be assigned purely logistical routes. He occupied the specific organizational middle ground of a person who was competent, reliable, and entirely invisible to the hierarchy above him, present at enough of the organization's movements to have accumulated significant operational knowledge, and sufficiently unregarded that nobody had thought to either develop him or worry about him. Raven had identified him in her third week as a person worth understanding, not because of what he could do for her immediately. He had no formal authority and no organizational leverage she could use in any direct sense, but her loyalty mapping had taught her that the most durable relational investments in any organization were rarely made at the top, where relationships were managed rather than genuine, but in the middle, where people were seen less and therefore responded with disproportionate loyalty to being seen at all. She began with attention, which was the only currency she had, and which cost her nothing because it was not a performance. She was genuinely interested in people, had always been, and Shin Tae-young was, once she looked at him with the focus the organization had never bothered to apply, an interesting person. She asked him about the city. This was her entry point, a question that appeared social and was, at a secondary level, informational, because a driver who had moved through Seoul's organizational geography for 7 years knew its physical and political texture in a way that no briefing document could replicate. He answered initially with the careful brevity of a man unaccustomed to being addressed directly by someone in her position. She listened to the brevity and asked a follow-up question that demonstrated she had actually heard what he said, which was apparently unusual enough to produce a small but visible adjustment in his posture. They had 4 conversations over 3 weeks, each one longer than the last, each one building on what had been established in the previous one, in the way that genuine conversations build rather than the way that managed ones do. By the 4th conversation, he was telling her things he had not been asked, observations about the organization's operations, assessments of situations he had witnessed from the 3rd car that the men in the 1st car had not thought to gather from him because drivers were not consulted. He was not being disloyal. He was responding to the specific and unfamiliar experience of having his knowledge treated as worth knowing. She held everything he gave her with the same care she applied to everything she was building, precisely, without immediate use, filed in the architecture that was growing more complete with every addition. She also, and this was not strategy but simply true, found that she looked forward to the conversations. 7 months into a contract that had given her very little that was genuinely human, Shin Tae-young's unguarded observations about the city and the organization and the small details of a life spent watching powerful people from the 3rd car were something she had not known she was missing. She filed that too, in a different part of the architecture, the part that was not about the organization at all. The financial vulnerability surfaced first, which was consistent with what her mapping had suggested. The organization's financial architecture was its most exposed layer, maintained by people who were operationally competent and strategically short-sighted, which was a combination that produced stability in normal conditions and fragility in abnormal ones. The abnormal condition arrived in month 4 in the form of a regulatory adjustment to one of the legitimate business fronts that the organization used for its primary laundering channel. The adjustment was not targeted, it was a broad policy change that affected the entire sector, but its effect on the park organization's specific structure was disproportionate because of a layering decision that had been made 18 months prior and that nobody had reassessed since. The exposure it created was not immediately visible. It would become visible in approximately 6 weeks when the quarterly reporting cycle produced numbers that would alert the organization's financial managers to a problem that would, by then, have compounded into something significantly more difficult to resolve. Raven identified it in week 2 of month 4. She resolved it in week 3 through a restructuring suggestion delivered not directly but through a conversation with the organization's administrative coordinator, a woman named Jian, who was peripheral enough to be spoken to without raising questions and whose access to the financial managers was regular and unremarkable. Raven framed the suggestion as a question about standard practice, asked with the casual curiosity of someone making conversation. Jian, who was more perceptive than her peripheral position suggested, took the question to the financial team as her own observation. The restructuring was implemented within the week. The vulnerability was closed. The quarterly report produced clean numbers. The financial managers congratulated themselves on having caught it. Raven noted the attribution and said nothing. The loyalty fault line she addressed in month 5 was more delicate. One of the 3 cases she had flagged, a senior lieutenant named Baek, whose grievance with Min Jun's decision-making in a territorial dispute 2 years prior had never been formally resolved, had begun showing the behavioral indicators of a man who was in early contact with an external party. Not yet actionable, not yet visible to the organization's internal monitoring, but present in the specific way that Raven had learned to read grievance when it was moving from passive to active. She addressed it through the loyalty map's second category, the members whose allegiance followed demonstrated competence, by engineering a situation in which Baek's historical territorial expertise was publicly recognized and formally consulted on a current decision. The recognition cost the organization nothing. It cost Baek his primary grievance, which was not the territorial dispute itself, but the specific feeling of having been dismissed by a leadership that did not value what he knew. His behavioral indicators normalized within 3 weeks. The external contact, deprived of its emotional fuel, did not progress. The resolution was attributed to Min Jun's leadership instinct. Raven noted the attribution and said nothing. She was 4 months into 18. The organization was more stable than it had been when she arrived, and not a single person inside it had connected that stability to the woman they had decided was decorative. She had not expected them to. She was not building toward their recognition. She was building toward something that would not require it. There was a version of this she had not planned for, which was the version where it was hard in ways that had nothing to do with strategy. She had planned for the operational difficulty, the sustained concentration required to maintain invisibility while building visibility, the precision needed to intervene without attribution, the discipline of holding her timeline against the instinct to move faster than the situation safely permitted. She had planned for all of that and found it demanding in the ways she had anticipated and manageable in the ways she had calculated. The operational difficulty was within the range of what she had prepared for. What she had not fully planned for was the specific interior cost of being, for 18 months, a person that nobody in her daily environment saw accurately. It was not loneliness in the conventional sense. She had experienced loneliness before and recognized its texture, and this was different. It was the more specific experience of a woman who was fully present in every room she occupied and registered in none of them as what she actually was, repeated daily across an extended period, with no available outlet and no person to whom she could be simply and completely herself without strategic consequence. The wall was necessary. She had decided that on the first Sunday in Seoul and had not revised it because the decision was correct. The wall was necessary and it was expensive, and the expense was paid entirely in private. She permitted herself 1 hour on Sunday evenings. She had established this in month 2 when she recognized that the containment required a managed release, or it would find its own unmanaged one, which she could not afford. 1 hour in which she was not performing composure, or managing attribution, or building anything. 1 hour in which she sat with the full weight of the situation she was in, the contract she had signed under duress, the home she had left, the specific indignity of being assessed as decorative by men whose organizations she was quietly maintaining, and allowed it to be what it was without immediately converting it into strategic information. It was not a pleasant hour, it was a necessary one. She thought about her father during some of these hours, with the complicated mixture of love and exhaustion that the situation produced, and that she could not simplify into something cleaner without being dishonest. She thought about the person she had been before Seoul, not with nostalgia, which was an emotion she had limited patience for, but with the specific attentiveness of someone checking that the person was still there, still intact, still recognizably herself beneath the performance the situation required. She was. That was the thing she checked for and consistently confirmed. The wall had not become the person. The performance had not replaced what it was performing over. She was still entirely herself, only herself in a context that required most of her to be invisible, which was different from being absent, though it did not always feel different at 1 o'clock on a Sunday morning. She closed the notebook at the end of the hour. She put the week's version of the weight back into its containment with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been doing this long enough to be competent at it. She went to sleep. Monday arrived. She built. She identified the opening move in month 13, which gave her 5 months before the contract's end, and what she initially assessed as sufficient time to manage the response without altering her timeline. The opening move was subtle, a shift in a rival syndicate's personnel positioning that was visible only if you were tracking the right indicators, which the park organization's intelligence operation was not, because its monitoring was configured around the threats that had historically materialized rather than the ones that were currently forming. Raven had been tracking the right indicators since month 3, not because she had anticipated this specific threat, but because comprehensive environmental mapping was how she operated, and comprehensive mapping produced early visibility into things that targeted monitoring missed. She began the dedicated analysis in month 13 and ran it for 6 weeks alongside everything else she was maintaining. What resolved from the analysis was more coordinated than she had initially assessed. The rival syndicate, the Choi organization, whose territorial ambitions had been a low-level presence in her mapping since month 4, had been building toward a specific move for approximately 8 months. The move was designed around a window of organizational vulnerability, and the window they had identified was the period immediately following Raven's contract expiration. They had done their intelligence work. They understood that her presence served a stabilizing function in Minjun's organization, not because they knew what she had been doing, but because they had observed the outcomes and correctly attributed them to a variable that would be removed at the contract's end. They did not know she was the variable. They knew only that the organization had been performing with unusual consistency for 18 months, and that the contracted wife's departure represented a change in conditions. The timing was precise and the planning was sound, and if it proceeded as designed, it would find the park organization at a genuine moment of structural exposure. Raven sat with this assessment for 4 days before she allowed herself to move toward a decision, because the decision had a cost she needed to fully understand before she committed to it. The cost was her timeline. She had planned to reveal what she had built at the contract's end, on her terms, in the sequence she had designed, with the full 18 months of accumulated evidence available as the foundation of her position. Acting on the Choi threat required deploying her organizational reach 3 weeks before that moment, in a context driven by necessity rather than her own preparation. It would reveal her capabilities earlier than she had chosen, and in a frame she had not designed. Against that cost, she placed the alternative, holding her timeline and allowing the Choi move to proceed, watching it find the vulnerabilities she had identified and intervening after the damage had begun. She could still neutralize it from that position. The neutralization would be messier and the damage to the organization would be real, even if temporary. She was not willing to let the organization absorb preventable damage to protect her timeline. That was the conclusion she reached at the end of the 4th day. And it was not a difficult conclusion once she examined it directly. It was simply a conclusion with a cost she had needed 4 days to fully accept. She accepted it. She began to plan the response. The timeline would have to take care of itself. She went to Park Sung-tae first, because Sung-tae was the loyalty map's most reliable node, the lieutenant whose allegiance was to organizational competence rather than to personality, who had been the first person in the organization to register her interventions without attributing them correctly, and who had, over 14 months of careful investment, developed a working relationship with her that neither of them had ever formally named. She told him what she had. Not the full picture immediately. She gave him the Choi threat analysis first, clean and documented, with the sourcing and the timeline and the specific vulnerability it was targeting. She watched him read it with the focused attention of a man who had spent 20 years in this environment and knew accurate intelligence from constructed intelligence, and was currently reconciling the quality of what he was reading with the person who had produced it. He looked up when he finished. She gave him the rest before he could ask. The personnel repositioning she had been tracking since month 3, the 8-month construction timeline she had mapped, the window the Choi organization had identified, and what it would find there if the response was not already in place. He asked her one question. How long had she been doing this? 14 months, she told him. The Choi threat was not an exception. She had a documented record of every organizational intervention she had made since month 4. The financial vulnerability in the fronting structure, the loyalty fault line, 6 other instances across the following 10 months, all of it held in the same careful architecture she had been building since her first Sunday in Seoul. She gave him the documentation. He read it in silence for a long time. Then he made 3 calls and the neutralization of the Choi threat began. It took 11 days and deployed organizational relationships that Raven had built from her position of supposed decorativeness across 14 months. Relationships the organization had not known existed, running through channels that the Choi intelligence operation had not mapped, because the channels ran through a woman they had not assessed as a variable. The neutralization was precise and complete, and left the Choi organization's 8 months of preparation without a viable target. Min-jun called her into his office on the 12th day. He had the documentation in front of him, all of it. Sung-tae had given him everything, which was what she had expected Sung-tae to do and had planned for. Min-jun had spent, she estimated, several days with it before this conversation, because the quality of his silence when she entered the room was the silence of a man who had already processed his initial response and was now in the more considered place beyond it. He did not speak immediately. He looked at her with the specific, complete attention of a man seeing something accurately for the first time after a long period of looking at it incorrectly. Then he said, "You've been protecting this organization for 14 months from inside a contract I used to contain you." "Yes," she said. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of a true thing settling into the space where a false one had been, finding the room larger than the false one had left it. "Why?" he said finally. She considered the question with the honesty it deserved. "Because it needed protecting," she said, "and because I was the only one who could see what it needed." He held her gaze for a long moment. What moved across his expression was not simple. It was the compound thing that arrived when a person of genuine intelligence encountered the full evidence of how significantly they had misjudged a situation they believed they had completely understood. He did not look away. Neither did she. The 3 weeks between the revelation and the contract's end had a different quality than anything that had preceded them. Not the sustained concealment of the previous 14 months, but the specific and unfamiliar experience of being visible in a room that was still recalibrating what visibility meant in her case. The organization processed it the way organizations process fundamental recalibrations, not all at once, not uniformly, but in the specific sequence determined by each person's proximity to the information and their individual capacity to revise a settled assessment. Sung-tae had revised his assessment in the office, in real time, with the efficiency of a man whose loyalty to competence made the revision straightforward once the competence was fully visible. Others took longer. A few required the additional evidence of watching the Choi neutralization's final stages resolve with the precision she had promised, which converted the remaining skepticism into the particular and durable respect that follows demonstrated accuracy under pressure. The relationship she had built held. This was the thing she had calculated and had not been entirely certain of until she saw it, that investments made genuinely, over time, in the specific currency of real attention and accurate seeing were not contingent on the invisibility that had allowed her to make them. Park Sung-tae remained what he had become across 14 months of careful investment. Ji-yeon, the administrative coordinator, whose peripheral position Raven had never treated as peripheral, moved through the newly visible landscape with the same ease she had always shown in their interactions, because their interactions had always been real rather than instrumental. The loyalty she had built person by person had not been dependent on the performance that surrounded it. It had been built on something more durable than that, and it demonstrated its durability now by remaining exactly what it was. Min-jun she saw differently across the 3 weeks than she had seen him in the preceding 14 months, because he was engaging with her differently, not with the managed distance of a man maintaining the terms of a contract, but with the focused and sometimes uncomfortable attention of a man working through a reckoning in real time. He reviewed the documentation methodically. He asked questions that were precise and genuine, rather than territorial. He was not, she observed, a man whose primary response to the revelation was ego. His primary response was the more interesting one of a genuinely intelligent person encountering evidence that their model of a situation was comprehensively wrong and attempting to build a more accurate one. He answered his questions with the same directness she had used in the office. He had been given the full picture. There was no longer a strategic reason for economy with him, and she did not maintain one artificially. On the 19th day, he asked her what she would have done differently if the contract had given her formal authority from the beginning, rather than none. She considered the questions seriously, moved faster on 2 of the interventions, made more noise about the Choi threat earlier, spent less energy on concealment and more on construction. He was quiet for a moment. How much more could you have built? She looked at him with the direct, unhurried attention she no longer had any reason to manage. Considerably more, she said. I was operating at partial capacity for 14 months. Everything you have seen is what I built with the hand I was given. He absorbed this without the defensive response that a smaller man would have produced. He simply held it, the specific, clear-eyed acknowledgement of someone updating their understanding of what they were dealing with. 3 days remained on the contract. The organization knew what she was. Min-jun knew what she had built. The question of what came next was present in every room she entered, held by everyone, but stated by no one, waiting for the contract's end to create the space in which it could be answered. She let it wait. She had waited 14 months. 3 days was nothing. The contract expired on a Thursday, which was the same day of the week she had arrived 18 months prior. She had not planned that symmetry, but she appreciated it in the way she appreciated all things that were both true and structurally elegant. She wore red, not as a statement. She had never required her clothing to make statements on her behalf, but because red was the color of a woman who had stopped calibrating her visibility and was simply, finally, entirely present. She had worn careful colors for 14 months. The careful colors had served their purpose. Their purpose was complete. The morning began in the operations room, with the senior membership assembled, not at her request, at Min-jun's, which was itself a visible indicator of the 3 weeks of reckoning that had preceded this day. He had called the assembly. She had arrived to it, which was a different choreography than any meeting she had attended in the previous 18 months, and which the room registered with the specific attentiveness of people watching a power structure make itself visible in real time. She said what she had come to say with the economy of someone who had prepared for this moment since her first Sunday in Seoul, and who understood that the preparation was sufficient and that excess would diminish rather than reinforce it. She laid out what she had built, not as a demand, not as a negotiation, but as a demonstration of existing fact. The organization was what it was in part because of what she had done inside it. The documentation was complete. The outcomes were verifiable. The relationships were present in the room. None of it required her to argue for its existence because its existence was simply true. She told them what she intended the next chapter to look like. Not an ultimatum, a proposal with the specific confidence of someone who understood that the proposal was the most accurate available description of what the situation actually required. The room received it in the particular silence of people who have been given complete information and have no remaining basis for an alternative position. Then they went outside, because the morning's other business required the street. The confrontation that had produced the scattered fruit was already resolved by the time she arrived, a territorial challenge from a Choi remnant, managed by the organization's restructured response protocols before it became anything requiring her direct attention. What remained was the aftermath. Black cars along the curb, suited men in the disciplined formation that the organization's new structure had made more precise, the urban morning going about its indifferent business around a scene it could not fully read. Min-jun knelt in the space between the cars and the market stalls with the specific and voluntary quality that distinguished recognition from defeat. He was not a man who had been broken. He was a man who had understood something true about the woman he had contracted to contain, about what she had built inside the containment, about what the organization was now and what had made it that way, and who was expressing that understanding in the most unambiguous register available to him. She stood at the center of everything, with the composed authority of a woman who had arrived at the place she had been building toward for 18 months, and found it exactly the size she had calculated. The men in black surrounding them were not her captors. They were not even precisely her subordinates. They were the organization she had built from the inside, arrayed around the partnership that had become, across 3 weeks of honest reckoning, the most accurate description of what the Park Empire actually was. She looked at Min-jun with the direct, unhurried attention she had stopped managing 3 weeks ago and would not manage again. He looked back at her with the full, clear-eyed recognition of a man who had been given the complete truth about his own organization, and had chosen, with the specific integrity of someone whose intelligence had finally caught up to his situation, to meet it honestly. The street continued around them. The morning light was ordinary and indifferent, and entirely insufficient to the weight of what was standing in it. Raven Monroe had arrived in Seoul without a choice. She was standing in it now on terms that were entirely her own, which were, as it turned out, the only terms she had ever been willing to accept, and the only terms the situation had ever actually offered, once you understood it completely. She had understood it completely since the first Sunday. She simply needed 18 months for the room to catch up. It had caught up. She was ready to begin. The most powerful move you can make in a room that has underestimated you is to let them keep underestimating you, while you build something they cannot dismantle. Raven Monroe did not fight the contract. She did not rage against the circumstances that produced it, or spend her energy demanding recognition from people who had already decided she was decorative. She took the hand she was dealt, an impossible hand, an unfair hand, and she played it with a patience and precision that turned captivity into the most comprehensive access she had ever had. Here is the lesson. Your circumstances do not determine your trajectory. Your decision about what to do inside your circumstances does. Raven was given 18 months and a position of zero formal authority. She built an empire with it. Not because the situation was fair, it wasn't. Not because the people around her recognized her value, they didn't. But because she made a decision on her first Sunday in a room she had not chosen to be in, that she would not waste the time she had been given. For everyone watching who feels trapped in a contract they didn't write, a job that doesn't see you, a situation that was handed to you without your consent, a room that has already decided what you are. You are not required to fight your way out loudly. You are not required to perform your worth for people who have already made their minds. Observe, build, wait for the moment the room runs out of options that don't include you. Then, sit down and tell them what comes next. The people who counted Raven out didn't lose because she overpowered them. They lost because while they were watching everything else, she became the most important thing in the room. Invisible is not the same as powerless. Quiet is not the same as waiting to be chosen. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can be is the person nobody thought to watch. Thanks for watching. You will find the video at the upper right of the video entertaining. You should check it out.